Midnight Narratives, where we explore the eerie, the forgotten, and the stories that linger in the quiet corners of Australia's past and present. Tonight, we're stepping behind the wire fence of a remote alpine property to uncover the lives of Desi's wife and 3 children raised in silence. You've heard about the ambush, you've seen the headlines, but behind the chaos was a family shaped by ideology, isolation, and fear. Let's begin. The woman in the shadows, Molly Freeman's life behind the fence. Molly Freeman never wanted to be famous. She didn't chase headlines, didn't seek attention. For most of her life, she was the quiet one, the woman behind the man, the mother behind the fence. But when her husband, Desi Freeman, allegedly ambushed police officers in one of the most violent rural standoffs in Victorian history, Molly's name was dragged into the spotlight. And what the public saw was just the surface. This is the story of Molly Freeman, from her quiet childhood in regional Victoria to the isolated life she built with Desi and the years of fear, control, and silence that finally exploded into national tragedy. Her childhood, the girl who blended in. Before she was Molly Freeman, she was Malia Nicholas. Born in the late 1970s in northern Victoria, Malia grew up in a small town where everyone knew everyone, and privacy was a luxury. Her father was a mechanic, her mother a part-time music teacher. They lived in a fibro house on the edge of town, surrounded by wheat fields and the low hum of cicadas. Malia was quiet, observant, and deeply sensitive. She loved music, especially piano, and spent hours practicing in the back room while her brothers played footy outside. Her mother encouraged her to teach, and by age 16, she was giving lessons to younger kids in town. She was known for her patience, her soft voice, and her ability to calm even the most restless child. But there was something else about Malia. She didn't quite fit in. She avoided parties, hated loud noises, and often retreated into books and journals. Teachers described her as brilliant but withdrawn. Friends said she was sweet but hard to read. She was the kind of girl who could disappear in a crowd, and sometimes she wanted to. Meeting Desi, the charmer with the cause. In her early 20s, Malia met Desmond Philby, who would later rename himself Desi Freeman. He was older, magnetic, and full of ideas. He spoke about government corruption, personal sovereignty, and the dangers of modern medicine. He was intense, persuasive, and deeply suspicious of authority. Malia was drawn in. Desi made her feel seen. He praised her intelligence, her gentleness, her ability to live simply. Within a year, they were married. And just like that, Malia Nicholas vanished. Molly Freeman was born. They moved to a remote property near Porepunkah, a 20-hectare block surrounded by bushland, far from prying eyes. Desi built solar panels, raised livestock, and set up a homeschooling curriculum for their future children. Molly taught music, tended the garden, and slowly disappeared from public life. Life on the farm, a dream turned cage. To outsiders, the Freeman property looked idyllic. Rolling hills, a vegetable patch, free-range chickens, and 3 healthy boys. Desi and Malia told friends they were giving their kids the dream childhood, free from screens, toxins, and government interference. But inside the house, things were different. Desi's beliefs grew darker. He joined sovereign citizen forums, refused to pay taxes, and began stockpiling weapons. He built homemade firearms, practiced tactical drills, and warned Molly that the system was coming for them. He refused to vaccinate the children, rejected all medical care, and banned outside visitors. Molly, according to neighbors, became increasingly withdrawn. She stopped attending community events. She rarely left the property. When she did, she looked pale, anxious, and exhausted. Friends who spoke to her said she seemed haunted, like she was carrying something she couldn't say out loud. They were born into silence. Raised on a remote property in Victoria's high country, far from schools, hospitals, and the hum of ordinary life. To the outside world, the Freeman children didn't exist. No birth certificates, no vaccinations, no records, just 3 boys growing up behind a wire fence, taught to fear the world beyond the paddocks. But on August 26, 2025, everything changed. Their father allegedly ambushed police officers in one of the most violent rural standoffs in Australian history. And suddenly, the children who had lived in the shadows were thrust into the spotlight. This is not a story about crime. It's a story about control, about ideology, about what happens when childhood is shaped not by love alone, but by fear, isolation, and belief systems that turn homes into cages. In 2018, the Freeman family appeared in a segment on A Current Affair titled Bogans from Mount Buffalo. The story focused on a feud between the Freemans and their neighbors who allegedly taunted them with chainsaws, dirt bikes, and verbal abuse. Desi and Molly claimed they were being harassed, but viewers saw something else, a family on edge, isolated, and deeply paranoid. Molly barely spoke during the interview. She stood beside Desi, nodding quietly, her eyes darting off camera. It was one of the few public glimpses into her life, and it raised more questions than answers. The breaking point, fear behind the fence. By 2025, Desi was under investigation for historic sexual assault allegations. Police had been building a case for months. Molly knew, she had confided in a friend, that Desi was a ticking time bomb. She feared what he might do if cornered, but she also feared leaving. Desi controlled everything: money, movement, even the children's education. On August 26, 2025, 10 officers arrived at the Freeman property to serve a warrant. What happened next was chaos. Desi allegedly opened fire with a homemade shotgun. 2 officers were killed, a third was wounded. Desi stole their weapons and radio and vanished into the bush. A massive manhunt began. Molly and the children were found hours later at a police station, shaken, silent, and safe. Aftermath: the woman who survived. Since the ambush, Molly Freeman has remained out of the public eye. She's reportedly in protective custody, cooperating with investigators, and trying to rebuild her life. Friends say she's beside herself with grief and guilt. She never pulled the trigger. She never planned the attack. But she lived with the man who did for over 20 years. Molly's story is not just about survival, it's about silence, about the quiet ways control can seep into a life, about how ideology can become a prison, and how even the most peaceful places, alpine farms, music rooms, vegetable gardens, can hide something terrifying. Based behind the fence, the Freeman children's life in isolation. They were born into silence, raised behind a wire fence on a remote alpine property, far from schools, hospitals, and the hum of ordinary life. To the outside world, the Freeman children were invisible until the day their father allegedly opened fire on police officers and the nation turned its gaze toward the quiet family in the hills. This is the story of 3 children who never chose the ideology they were born into, who were taught to fear the world beyond the paddocks, and who, in the end, walked out of the shadows and into the arms of a society they'd been taught to distrust. The birth of a belief system. Desi and Molly Freeman believed they were giving their children the dream life. No screens, no vaccines, no government interference, just fresh air, homegrown food, and the freedom to learn on their own terms. Their first son was born in the early 2000s. The second followed a few years later. The third, a baby, was still in nappies when the ambush occurred. All 3 were born at home without medical intervention. Molly, a former music teacher, handled their education. Desi taught them survival skills, bushcraft, and his own version of history. They were never enrolled in school, never saw a GP, never received a birth certificate, according to some reports. To Desi, they weren't citizens. They were sovereign beings. To Molly, they were her world. Childhood in the high country. The Freeman property near Porepunkah was vast, 20 hectares of bushland, livestock, and solar panels. The children roamed freely, climbing trees, tending animals, and learning through experience. Molly taught them piano, reading, and basic maths. Desi taught them how to build, shoot, and distrust authority. Neighbors rarely saw them. When they did, the boys were polite but distant. They didn't make eye contact. They didn't speak unless prompted. One neighbor described them as like shadows, always watching, never engaging. Inside the home, things were tightly controlled. Desi monitored everything: food, movement, even conversation. Molly, though loving, was under constant pressure. Friends say she tried to shield the children from Desi's rage, but there was only so much she could do. The 2018 incident, a glimpse into their world. When the Freeman family appeared in a segment on A Current Affair, it also gave Australia its first glimpse of the Freeman children. They stood beside their parents, silent and still. The eldest boy looked wary, the middle child clung to Molly's side, the youngest was just a toddler. Viewers were struck by their stillness, the way they seemed to fade into the background, like props in a story they didn't understand. It was clear they weren't used to cameras or strangers or questions. The ambush, trauma in real time. On August 26, 2025, 10 officers arrived at the Freeman property to serve a warrant over historic sexual assault charges. Desi allegedly opened fire with a homemade shotgun, killing 2 officers and wounding a third. He stole their weapons and radio and vanished into the bush. Initial reports feared the worst, that Desi had taken Molly and the children hostage, but hours later they appeared at a local police station, safe, silent, and in shock. The children had witnessed everything, the gunfire, the chaos, the disappearance of their father. For years, they'd been told the police were the enemy. Now, they were being protected by them. Aftermath, rebuilding from silence. Since the ambush, the Freeman children have been placed under protective care. Their names have not been released, their faces have not been shown, they are once again invisible, but this time for their own safety. Psychologists say they face a long road ahead. Years of isolation, indoctrination, and trauma don't disappear overnight. They'll need therapy, education, and a chance to build identities outside their father's ideology. Molly, according to friends, is beside herself with guilt. She's trying to rebuild, to give her children the life she once dreamed of, without fear, without control, without Desi. Closing, the children of the fence. The Freeman children are not criminals, they are survivors. Raised in a world of silence, ideology, and fear, they now face the challenge of becoming themselves outside the shadow of their father. Their story is a reminder that belief systems don't just affect adults, they shape childhoods, they build fences around minds, and sometimes the most powerful act of rebellion is simply walking away. The Freeman children didn't choose this life, they didn't choose the ideology, they didn't choose the silence. They were born into it, raised by it, and now they must unlearn it. Their story is still unfolding, quietly, privately, far from the cameras. But it's a reminder that belief systems don't just shape adults, they shape childhoods, they build fences around minds. And sometimes the most powerful act of rebellion isn't loud, it's simply stepping outside the gate. If stories like this resonate with you, if you find yourself drawn to the quiet tragedies, the eerie corners of history, and the lives lived just beyond the edge of the map, consider subscribing. It helps me keep digging, keep telling, and keep giving voice to the stories that rarely get heard. And if you liked this episode, a like goes a long way. It tells the algorithm that these stories matter, that silence deserves a spotlight. Thanks for watching. Stay curious, stay kind, and I'll see you in the next one.